I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories were just that. Stories crafted to scare and entertain, nothing more. At least, that's what I told myself until I spent a night in that hospital. Even now, as I write this, I can feel the cold weight of dread pressing against me. What I experienced there wasn't just scary. It was something far worse, something evil. It all started when I took a temporary job as a night security guard at an old hospital that was scheduled for demolition. The place had been shut down for years, and my job was simple: patrol the halls, make sure no one broke in, and lock up before sunrise. Easy money, or so I thought. The hospital had a reputation, though. Locals whispered about strange noises, unexplained shadows, and an overall sense of unease. They called it the haunted ward. But I wasn't one to buy into that kind of thing. When I arrived for my first shift, the place already felt off. The building was massive, with peeling paint, flickering lights, and a musty smell that clung to the air. My supervisor handed me a flashlight and a set of keys. "Stay on the main floors," he said, avoiding eye contact, "and don't wander into the basement." "The basement?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He hesitated, then shrugged. "It's just storage. Nothing to see down there. Stick to the main patrol route and you'll be fine." That was my first warning, though I didn't recognize it at the time. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. I walked the empty halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you start hearing things that aren't there. Around 2 a.m., I heard it for the first time. A faint sound, like someone humming. I stopped, shining my flashlight down the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No answer. I told myself it was just the wind or some old pipe settling. But the sound came again, closer this time. It was a soft, lilting tune, almost like a lullaby. I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The humming led me to a room near the end of the hall. The plaque on the door read "Pediatrics." When I stepped inside, the air was freezing. My breath clouded in front of me, and the smell of antiseptic stung my nose. The room was filled with old hospital beds, each one covered with a dusty sheet. At the far end of the room, a child's rocking chair swayed back and forth, creaking softly. But there was no one there. I backed out of the room, heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. By the third night, the unease had settled into my bones. The hospital felt alive, like it was watching me. I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shapes that disappeared when I turned my head. Doors creaked open on their own, and lights flickered even when the power was supposedly shut off. I kept to the main patrol route, just as my supervisor had instructed. But on that third night, something changed. I was walking past the elevator when I heard it, a loud clang, followed by a scraping noise. It was coming from below. From the basement. I hesitated, my supervisor's warning echoing in my mind. But curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the button to call the elevator, and when the doors opened, the stale smell of damp concrete wafted out. As I descended, the air grew colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed through the space, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping. When I stepped out of the elevator, I immediately regretted it. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and abandoned equipment. Rusted gurneys, broken wheelchairs, and old medical supplies were scattered everywhere. The tapping grew louder, leading me to a door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out into the hallway. I pushed the door open and froze. The room was filled with old hospital files, scattered haphazardly across the floor. In the center of the room stood an operating table, its surface stained with something dark. Hanging above it was a single, flickering bulb. And then I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the corner facing the wall. Its silhouette was distorted, like it didn't quite fit the space it occupied. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly turned to face me. It wasn't human. Its face was pale and featureless, with empty black pits where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Just a horrible, gaping silence. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and the sound of the figure's footsteps echoed toward me. I ran. I didn't quit after that night. I should have, but something compelled me to stay. It was as though the hospital itself wouldn't let me go. On my fourth and final night, everything came to a head. The whispers started as soon as I walked through the doors. This time they weren't faint. They were loud, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. The walls vibrated with an unnatural hum, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I tried to stick to my patrol, but the hospital had other plans. The halls twisted and changed, leading me in circles. Doors slammed shut behind me, locking me in. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. The figure from the basement. It was standing at the end of the hallway, its eyeless face turned toward me. In its hand it held a scalpel, the blade glinting in the dim light. It started to move toward me, its steps slow and deliberate. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The hospital seemed to come alive around me, its walls closing in, its lights flickering wildly. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through my head. I don't remember how I made it out. One moment I was running for my life, and the next I was outside, gasping for air. I quit the next day. I thought I had left the nightmare behind when I quit that job. I told myself that whatever I had experienced in the hospital was in the past, and the further I got from it, the safer I would feel. But some things don't stay buried, especially not things like that. The first few days after I left were uneventful. I moved back to my small apartment, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. I avoided talking about what had happened, convincing myself that if I didn't acknowledge it, it couldn't touch me anymore. But the hospital wasn't done with me. It started small, little things that were easy to dismiss. My apartment would feel colder than usual, even when the heat was on full blast. Lights flickered, but I chalked it up to faulty wiring. Then came the dreams. Every night I'd find myself back in the hospital. I'd be walking those endless twisting hallways, hearing the whispers grow louder with every step. The figure from the basement was always there, lurking just out of sight. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the sound of its footsteps still echoing in my ears. At first, I convinced myself they were just nightmares. But then, I started waking up to strange things in my apartment. Doors I had locked would be wide open. Objects weren't where I had left them. One night, I found muddy footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. The breaking point came about a week later. I was heading home from work, taking the elevator up to my floor. The building wasn't the newest, so the elevator was slow and creaky. But that night, something was different. As soon as the doors closed, I felt it. The air inside was heavy, suffocating, just like the basement of the hospital. The overhead light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then, the elevator stopped. It wasn't my floor. The doors opened to pitch blackness. The hallway beyond was empty, silent. I hit the button to close the doors, but they didn't respond. That's when I heard it, a faint humming, the same tune I had heard on my first night in the hospital. The figure stepped into view just beyond the threshold. It was exactly as I remembered it, pale, eyeless, and utterly wrong. "Why?" it rasped, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a step forward, and the elevator doors slammed shut. The lights went out completely, and the elevator began to plummet. When the lights flickered back on, the elevator was still. The doors opened to my floor as though nothing had happened. I stumbled out shaking and ran to my apartment. By this point, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I needed answers. Desperate, I searched online for anything about the hospital, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening to me. What I found was worse than I expected. The hospital had a dark history. It had been built in the 1930s and was originally a tuberculosis sanatorium. Over the years, it had gained a reputation for cruelty and malpractice. Patients went in and never came out. Whispered rumors spoke of illegal experiments, unexplained deaths, and a wing that had been sealed off after something unspeakable happened there. I found an old article about the hospital's closure. It mentioned a nurse named Helen Cartwright, who had gone missing in the 1950s. According to the article, she had been working in the basement when she disappeared. Some said she was murdered by a deranged patient. Others believed she had been conducting experiments of her own and had become a victim of whatever she had summoned. The descriptions of Helen's appearance matched the figure I had seen. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator named Greg, someone I had found through an online forum. He was skeptical at first, but agreed to help after I described what had been happening. Greg arrived at my apartment armed with all sorts of equipment: EMF detectors, cameras, audio recorders, and even a spirit box. He was calm and methodical, which made me feel a little better, until the investigation began. The moment Greg stepped into my apartment, his EMF detector went haywire. The needle shot to the red zone, and the air grew icy. "Something's definitely here," he said, his voice tight. As we set up the equipment, Greg explained how the spirit box worked. It scanned through radio frequencies, allowing spirits to communicate through the static. I wasn't sure I believed in any of it, but I was willing to try anything. When Greg turned on the spirit box, the room filled with a chaotic mix of static and faint voices. At first, the words were indistinct, but then a single word cut through the noise. "Basement." Greg and I exchanged a glance. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means whatever this is, it's tied to the hospital," Greg said, "and it wants you to go back." The thought of returning to that place filled me with dread, but Greg insisted it was the only way to put an end to this. He believed the spirit, Helen or whatever it was tethered to the hospital and needed to be confronted there. Armed with Greg's equipment and a heavy dose of fear, we returned to the abandoned hospital late at night. The building looked even more ominous than I remembered, its broken windows like empty eyes watching us approach. Inside, the air was thick with decay, and every step echoed through the empty halls. The whispers started almost immediately, faint at first but growing louder as we made our way toward the basement. When we reached the elevator, Greg hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "No," I admitted, "but we don't have a choice." The elevator groaned as we descended, the same oppressive darkness enveloping us. When the doors opened, the basement was exactly as I remembered it: cold, damp, and filled with an unnatural silence. Greg set up his equipment while I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run. The spirit box crackled to life, and a distorted voice came through. "Leave." The lights flickered, and shadows moved in the corners of the room. Greg began speaking calmly, trying to communicate with the entity. "Why are you here?" he asked. The response was immediate. "Trapped." "What do you want?" "Justice." Before Greg could ask another question, the room erupted in chaos. Equipment flew off the table, and the air filled with a deafening roar. The figure appeared more solid than ever, its eyeless face twisted with rage. I don't remember much after that. Greg later told me I collapsed, screaming, as the entity lunged toward me. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. Greg was sitting nearby, looking pale and shaken. "It's over," he said. "At least I think it is." "What happened?" I asked. Greg explained that after I passed out, he had performed a cleansing ritual, using salt and sage to banish the spirit. He wasn't sure if it had worked, but the hospital felt different when we left, as though a weight had been lifted. Even now, I can't say for certain if it's truly over. The nightmares have stopped, and my apartment feels normal again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers and feel the cold touch of unseen eyes watching me. Whatever was in that hospital may be gone, but I don't think it's forgotten. And I'll never forget it either. Even after Greg assured me the spirit had been banished, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, the quiet too loud. It wasn't just paranoia, I could feel it. An oppressive, heavy presence lingering just out of sight. Whatever we'd done in the hospital, it wasn't over. I had thought I was free. I was wrong. It started again a few nights later. The whispers came first, faint but unmistakable. At first, I convinced myself they were my imagination, remnants of my trauma playing tricks on me. But then came the cold spots in my apartment, the flickering lights, and the sensation of being watched. One night, as I was lying in bed, I woke up to the sound of humming, the same eerie tune I'd heard in the hospital. My heart froze. I sat up, scanning the room, but saw nothing. Then I felt it, a pressure on the edge of the bed, as though someone, or something, had sat down. I didn't dare move. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding me. And then I heard it clear as day. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was raspy, feminine, and filled with anger. I called Greg the next morning, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I don't think we got rid of it," he admitted. "Whatever this is, it's stronger than we thought. It's not just tied to the hospital anymore, it's tied to you." The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. What do we do now? "There's one last thing we can try," Greg said, "but it's dangerous." Greg arrived that evening with more equipment and a small leather-bound book filled with rituals and incantations. He explained that we would perform a binding ritual to sever the connection between me and the entity. "We'll need to go back to where it all started," he said. "The hospital?" He shook his head. "The basement." I didn't think I could do it, but I didn't have a choice. Whatever was haunting me was growing stronger, and if we didn't act fast, I was sure it would consume me completely. The hospital felt different this time. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. It was as though the building itself was alive, watching us, waiting. We made our way to the basement, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. When we reached the elevator, it was already open, as though it had been waiting for us. Neither of us said a word as we stepped inside. The descent was slow, each second stretching into an eternity. When the doors finally opened, the basement was even darker than I remembered. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and the whispers were deafening. Greg set up his equipment while I stood frozen, clutching the book he had given me. The ritual required both of us. Greg would create a protective circle, and I would read the incantation to banish the spirit. As I began to read, the temperature in the room plummeted. The whispers turned into screams, and shadows darted across the walls. The entity appeared, more solid than ever, its eyeless face twisted with rage. "You cannot stop me," it hissed. I kept reading, my voice trembling but steady. The air around us seemed to warp, and the ground beneath my feet shook. The entity lunged toward me, but it hit the edge of the protective circle and recoiled with a shriek. The ritual was working, but the entity wasn't going down without a fight. It thrashed against the barrier, its screams growing louder and more desperate. The shadows in the room converged, forming grotesque shapes that clawed at the circle. Greg shouted for me to keep going, his voice barely audible over the chaos. I forced myself to focus, pouring every ounce of strength I had into the words. Then, with one final ear-piercing scream, the entity vanished. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Greg and I left the hospital in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. When we reached my apartment, he performed one final cleansing ritual to ensure the entity couldn't follow me back. "I think it's over," he said, though his tone was cautious. "Think?" I asked, my voice raw. Greg shrugged. "With things like this, there are no guarantees. But whatever was haunting you, it's gone for now." The weeks that followed were the calmest I'd had in months. The whispers stopped, the nightmares faded, and my apartment felt like home again. But the experience left scars, emotional ones that I wasn't sure would ever heal. Even now, I still find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the entity lurking in the shadows. Sometimes I hear faint whispers late at night, though they might just be my imagination. One thing is certain, I'll never set foot in that hospital again. I'd like to believe that the nightmare is over, that the entity is truly gone. but deep down, I know that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. If you ever find yourself in an old hospital and the air feels too cold, the whispers too loud, leave. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't go to the basement. Because some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.